She didn't know about the $1 trillion trust fund that had just been transferred into her name, but he knew exactly what he was doing when he walked out the door. The newborn in her arms hadn't stopped crying for 3 hours, but the formula was gone. The heat had been shut off, and the snow outside was falling so thick she could barely see the street through the frosted window. He had left her, not just emotionally, but physically abandoned them both, in a ground-floor apartment with no money, no family, and winter closing in like a fist. She was starving, the baby was starving, but the lawyers who had been trying to reach her couldn't get through because he'd canned her phone 2 days before he disappeared. What she did in the 72 hours that followed would transform her from a desperate mother on the edge of death into something he never anticipated. But by the time he came crawling back, begging on his knees with tears streaming down his face, it was far too late. Had he known what was waiting in her bloodline, had he calculated that leaving her at her lowest point would somehow benefit him later, and when the truth finally reached her, when she discovered the inheritance that had been hers all along, would mercy be possible? Or would the snow that nearly killed her become the cold justice he truly deserved? The apartment was so cold that morning that Emma Thorne could see her breath hanging in the air like small ghosts. But the baby bundled against her chest was warm, and that was all that mattered in the moment. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, but the hunger pangs had dulled into a distant ache that felt more like a memory than a physical sensation. The snow had been falling since midnight, but the window was drafty, and ice had begun forming on the inside of the glass in delicate, cruel patterns. Tyler had left 3 days ago, but the space he'd occupied in her life still felt raw, like a wound that wouldn't close. He'd taken everything, not just his clothes and his laptop, but the debit card, the checkbook, the spare cash she'd hidden in the coffee tin. But he'd missed the wedding ring she'd already pawned the week before to buy diapers. The formula was gone now, too, but she'd been trying to nurse little Ava with breasts that produced barely anything because her own body was consuming itself for lack of food. Emma had been beautiful once, tall and graceful with honeycombed hair and gray-green eyes that Tyler had said reminded him of the Pacific. But 3 days of starvation and stress had hollowed her cheeks and darkened the circles beneath those eyes. She'd met Tyler at a corporate event 2 years ago, but their whirlwind romance had hidden the truth about who he really was. He'd been charming and attentive, but the mask had begun slipping the moment she got pregnant. He'd been supportive in public, but behind closed doors, he'd grown cold, calculating, distant. The night Ava was born, Emma had thought she'd seen tears in his eyes, but looking back now, she wondered if that had been the reflection of the hospital lights. He'd held the baby for exactly 4 minutes, but his hands had been stiff, awkward, and when the nurse tried to show him how to support Ava's head properly, he'd handed her back with an excuse about needing to make a work call. The phone on the kitchen counter had been disconnected, but Emma didn't know that yet. When she tried to call her mother's old number, a number that had been out of service for 7 years, ever since the car accident that had taken both her parents on a rainy November evening. She'd been 21 then, but grief had made her older overnight. She'd had no siblings, but her parents had been her entire world, and losing them had set her adrift in ways she still didn't fully understand. Tyler had seemed like salvation when she met him, but salvation, she now understood, could wear the mask of damnation if you weren't careful. Ava whimpered against her chest, but Emma had nothing to give her except the soft humming of a lullaby her own mother used to sing. The melody was sad, but it was also a connection to something permanent, something that transcended the cold and hunger and fear. The radiator in the corner hadn't worked in 4 days, but the landlord had stopped returning her calls weeks ago when Tyler stopped paying rent. What Emma didn't know, what she couldn't possibly know because the lawyer's letters had been intercepted, their calls blocked, their emails filtered into a spam folder by the same man who'd abandoned her, was that her maternal grandfather, a man she'd never met and whose existence she'd only learned about in fragments from her mother's carefully guarded stories, had died 6 weeks earlier in Singapore.